Even before the whole spy balloon debacle, U.S.-China relations were not in a good place. Now they're even worse, and Taiwan is at the center of the standoff. Beijing sees the island as a breakaway province that must be reunited with the motherland. Now, the U.S. military is not obliged to defend Taiwan from invasion. Still, the U.S. armed forces are actively training to intervene on Taiwan's side if a war does break out. And as the world's Patrick Wynn tells us, rhetoric from Pentagon officials about China and Taiwan has some experts worried.
The U.S. military's top brass seems to think that China will invade Taiwan by 2027. This belief even has a name, the 2027 Davidson window, named for Phil Davidson, a retired Navy admiral who's popularized the idea. Now, a four-star Air Force general is saying his gut tells him China will invade by 2025. As for the current U.S. Navy chief, Mike Gilday, here's his assessment from 3 months ago.
When we talk about the 2027 window, in my mind, that has to be a 2022 window or potentially a 2023 window.
China did not invade Taiwan last year, and many experts who study China's Communist Party don't put much stock in the 2027 timeline either.
I think this is just completely off base.
Ian Johnson is with the Council on Foreign Relations. He speaks Chinese and lived in China for decades. Until very recently, he said, it looked like the U.S. and China might be ready to dial back the tension.
I thought up until the spy balloon, the pendulum was swinging back ever so slightly.
But in recent congressional hearings, Pentagon officials are again pointing to 2027. It's based on a stated goal by China's military, the People's Liberation Army, to become fully modern by the PLA's 100th anniversary in 2027. Taiwan is a de facto sovereign state, founded in 1949 by Chinese anti-communists. Beijing still sees the island as an integral part of China, and many Pentagon officials assume that as soon as China finishes modernizing its army, it will invade.
The problem in Washington is that when a military person says something, it gains this credence because people think, oh, well, they must really know something. They must have military intelligence that we don't know.
Ian Johnson says these military predictions about 2027 don't line up with political analysis of China's Communist Party or its leader, Xi Jinping. Invading Taiwan would be a huge gamble. And Johnson says Xi isn't much of a gambler.
He's more of a cautious person. He's ruthlessly built out his power base, but he's not somebody that makes crazy decisions on a whim.
Or because his army has a big anniversary coming up. Beijing has been threatening Taiwan more and more. 6 months ago, after U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited the island, China briefly surrounded it with fighter jets and warships.
China is increasingly bellicose, and the Chinese leadership is a bit of a black box.
But even inside the Pentagon, some generals say this speculation game is getting out of hand. Here's Air Force Chief of Staff Charles Brown speaking on Monday.
There's been speculation. That speculation is not necessarily helpful. I've been disappointed by some of the comments that have been made.
General Brown says an invasion is not destined to happen.
I don't see that conflict is imminent or inevitable, and the goal is to avoid it.
Predicting an adversary is gearing up for war might stoke a sense of urgency or help secure bigger military budgets. But it has its risks. Ian Johnson sees parallels to the dawn of World War I.
Each side assumed the other was mobilizing, and therefore they had to mobilize. And before you know it, Europe's marching to war without anybody really wanting that to happen.
The U.S. isn't bound by any treaty to fight China over Taiwan, though President Joe Biden has suggested twice that he would use force to protect the island. For now, more friction over Taiwan looks likely. Beijing has warned Taiwan's leaders not to let any more U.S. lawmakers visit the island. But there's a congressional delegation now discussing a trip for this spring. For The World, I'm Patrick Wynn.
Today, the president of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi, made a big visit to China. No Iranian leader has visited in 20 years. The two parties both say they discuss nuclear policy, but what else is there to what seems to be a diplomatic curve, if anything? Anush Etishami joins us to understand this better. He's a professor of international relations at Durham University in the UK and knows a lot about Iran's diplomacy. Based on what's come out of this meeting, what do you see as the main headlines here?
I think actually there is a lot riding on this for both parties. If I may, I'll just quickly look at the Chinese position. For China, Iran is a valued asset because of its ideological standing with regard to the West and the US in particular. But also, President Xi Jinping's visit to Saudi Arabia last month left quite a bitter taste in the mouth of the Iranians, in that he saw not just all the heads of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries around the Saudis, but also many Arab leaders who traveled to Riyadh. And in that summit, 3 statements that came out were quite problematic from Iran's perspective. One was about the need to make sure that there is respect for every country in terms of law and order and security. The second was that Iran must ensure that its nuclear program remains peaceful. And the third was that there must be negotiations and dialogue over the 3 islands in the Persian Gulf. For Iran, all these 3 are red lines. And so, of course, the vice premier was hurriedly sent to Tehran following Iran's protestations. And then an invitation was issued to President Raisi to go to Beijing. And here we are. So for Chinese to kind of smooth all these wrinkles is important, because Iran, in many ways, is the last El Dorado in this part of Asia. Market of 85 million people, highly educated, vast natural resources. Oil, gas are just tip of the iceberg. And of course, geopolitically, very well placed for access to Europe, to the Mediterranean, to the Indian Ocean, but also the vast expanses of the Caucasus and Central Asia. For the Iranians, on the other hand, the relationship is even more significant because Iran doesn't have many friends exactly, regionally and internationally. Raisi is welcome in Moscow. That's about it, really. And it seems to have thrown its lot with the Russian aggression against Ukraine, which I suspect will come back to bite it down the line. China is Iran's largest trading partner. It's the biggest importer of Iran's oil. It has promised through this 25-year agreement signed in 2021 to pour in many billions of dollars into Iran's economy, whether for energy, whether for infrastructure, whether for building and construction and petrochemicals and such like. Raisi has gone there partly to make sure that the Chinese live up to expectations.
Is Beijing in a position to choose sides in this kind of perennial Iran-Saudi Arabia face-off?
Well, actually, I don't think the Chinese want to be in that position. The Chinese want to be able to ride the storm, to stay clear of petty squabbles. I mean, their trade with the GCC, with Saudi Arabia,
Gulf Cooperation Council,
is very lucrative. Yeah, the Saudis are completely committed to expansion of ties with China. The UAE's trade with China is more than 3 times what Iran's is with China. And you put that in context of the UAE's Emirates population of about 10 million people, then you'll see exactly how important those markets are to the Chinese. And Xi Jinping's visit to Riyadh was precisely to underline these links. But also, the Chinese can't afford to have it at the expense of Iran, because Iran really is the remaining jewel in the crown.
Obviously, we have to see the economic potential of a China-Iran relationship that this visit today by Raisi to Beijing represents in part. But what do you make of these statements issued by both sides on nuclear policy? China said they are with Iran in solidarity, but also seem to offer help with some kind of nuclear peace deal like the one Iran has been negotiating with the U.S. and Europe. What's going on there?
I think the Chinese are telling the world, not the Iranians, that, look, we've got to fix this JCPOA,
the nuclear
deal. He tore it up in 2018, quite visibly and physically, as you remember. That has led to a major crisis in terms of Iran's nuclear program, because Iran is now enriching uranium unhindered to levels well beyond what was agreed in the JCPOA, the Joint Cooperation Agreement over the nuclear program. And Iran is now enriching 65, 70 above % of uranium, which is dangerous because that's now reaching weapons grade. For China, proliferation is a really bad thing. In this part of the world, is not good news for them because A, it threatens Israel, another of China's close security economic partners, and also it will encourage Saudi Arabia to proliferate as well. And that's absolutely no good to them, one. Secondly, it's very clear that so long as Trump-type sanctions remain on Iran, China cannot unleash the potential in trade and investment in Iran.
Well, that's a kind of optimistic way of looking at it. I think of what China said, that they are with Iran in solidarity. What do you think that means? Is it just supportive words, or could that actually maybe mean they'll help with Iran's weapons program?
No. Those are just forms of words that Iranians would like to hear as they kind of roll up their sleeves to try and re-enter a negotiating theater. So you can see that the Chinese have got all the cards this time round. And the invitation to Raisi, of course, is like Raisi going into, the golden trap.
Anush Etishami is a professor of international relations at Durham University in the UK, where he focuses on Iran's diplomacy. We begin today way up in the stratosphere, and this question, what is up with all these balloons? The U.S. has shot down 4 flying objects in recent weeks. At least one was a Chinese balloon, and now China is accusing Washington of its own balloon espionage program, one that's allegedly sending high-altitude balloons over western China and Tibet. The Biden administration denies the claim. This tit for tat is being watched closely by military balloon experts like my next guest. Tom Carrico is senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Tom, where do balloons fit into a larger military strategy?
I think this is a bit of a wake-up call for a lot of folks. Balloons technology has been around for a very long time. It's a pretty useful platform for a heavy payload to do just tons and tons of different missions. Including, by the way, some pretty sophisticated surveillance, which presumably this first Chinese balloon was undertaking over American ICBM fields. Lighter than air aircraft in the coming years, whether it be for surveillance, whether it be for air and missile threat tracking and detection, you're going to see more of this. There's also, frankly, just some utility here in terms of the public perception waking up to a range of Chinese activities.
And that's because you believe there will be more balloons sent into the sky, or just because we now are aware of it?
I would say it's fundamentally because of the utility of the platform. Satellites are zipping around, and they're not able to be persistent for a period of time. There's also utility to being closer to the Earth, including for electronic intelligence collection. There's speculation that perhaps what this Chinese balloon was doing was not really taking pictures, which you can do from space, but perhaps trying to gobble up some of our electronic communications, maybe cell phone communications or similar things near some sensitive military site. It's also, by the way, possible to have much heavier payload that is pretty expensive to put into orbit.
So, Tom, going back to the object shot out of the sky by the U.S. military, still a lot of confusion there. We know the first one was definitely a balloon. We know less about the other 3 objects. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre did say this on Monday.
There is no indication of aliens or extraterrestrial activity with these recent takedowns.
Yeah, well, the focus on ET seems a little glib considering the potential danger these objects pose. What do we know about these other objects the U.S. has taken out of the skies?
We don't yet know, according to Pentagon and White House spokespeople, exactly what some of these others were that were taken down. Hopefully we'll find out. I think what's changed in part is that we have changed how we are seeing these things. In the past, the sensors and the computers attached to the sensors for things like NORAD, that protects North America against aerial threats, they had filters on the data to basically say, give me a ping if the radars pick up something that's moving very fast and looks like a bomber. That was one reason that they weren't seeing, or at least the operators weren't seeing, what perhaps the radar energy was seeing, because the algorithms were standing in the way. They took those filters off, and all of a sudden you see lots of other aerial phenomena being picked up, being engaged, and yes, being shot down. So this really points to the overall need to have greater domain awareness for the full spectrum of potential aerial threats.
Yeah, go a little deeper on that, Tom. What do Washington and the Pentagon need to do to be better protected from balloon operations, wherever they may be coming from?
I think you're probably going to see some congressional hearings digging into this. There's going to be some pontificating about, why weren't we looking for these aerial threats? Everybody knows that drones of various stripes, including lighter-than-air drones, are out there and about. I'm optimistic from the Pentagon side, from NORAD, and from Capitol Hill, you're going to have more people looking up. I don't think you have to be too imaginative to put together, to connect some dots. It's not just about balloons. This is part of an industrial scale espionage undertaking that China has been doing for years now.
Tom Carrico is a senior fellow and missile defense project director at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Tom, thank you very much. This is fascinating. It's been almost a year since Russia launched an all-out invasion of Ukraine. It's been hard to see how exactly this ends. If you ask Ukraine's leaders, victory will come when Russians are kicked out of all of Ukraine. That includes the Crimean Peninsula. This territory was illegally annexed by Russia in 2014. Some of the people most impacted by this have been Crimean Tatars. The Tatars are a Turkic ethnic group, predominantly Muslim, who have lived in Crimea for centuries. The World's Daniel Hoffman spoke with some of them in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv.
Chibureki is the Crimean Tatar national dish. They're deep-fried turnovers filled with ground beef or lamb and onions, and they're a specialty here at Irfan Kudusov's restaurant.
Добрый день, меня зовут Эрфан Кудусов.
Kudusov is 54 years old, he's a father of 4, and he's a Crimean Tatar activist. The walls of this place are covered in photographs, paintings, postcards. The restaurant feels a little like a museum.
Вот особенно вот это интересно, видите, как птица в клетке такое.
There's one striking painting with a stork confined in a golden cage. The cage is so tight that the bird can't even spread its wings, Kudusov says.
Эта птица в клетке, это как крымские татары.
That bird in the cage is like the Crimean Tatar people, he explains. Crimea is golden. It's a beautiful place, he says. But Crimean Tatars who live there are under Russian occupation, and they've lived like that for almost 9 years. In February 2014, Russian troops entered Crimea. Then Russia staged a referendum vote, and within a couple of weeks, Moscow made it official.
Республики Крым и города Севастополь.
At the Kremlin, President Vladimir Putin declared that Crimea is part of the Russian Federation. Nearly the entire international community said that the annexation was illegal. Samuel Cherub is a political scientist with the Rand Corporation think tank.
This was a major political boost for Putin, the annexation of Crimea, and I think Putin has come to view Crimea as an organic part of Russia as much as any other undisputed region. It has this additional strategic importance as the base of Russia's Black Sea Fleet.
Cherub says Crimea is a huge part of Putin's legacy and his current political standing. For the Ukrainians, it's simply Russian-occupied territory.
Наша ціль деокупувати всі наші території. Крим є нашою землею.
Last month at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, President Volodymyr Zelensky said, Crimea is our land, our sea, and our mountains, and that Ukraine will liberate the region. Here's Samuel Cherub again.
Ukraine, under no circumstances, even before the war, would have been willing to cede its legal claim to the peninsula. I think the issue is what militarily makes sense for the Ukrainians, whether retaking Crimea would be plausible, and even if plausible, worth the escalation risks.
So militarily, it's very difficult.
That's Jeffrey Edmonds. He's with the Center for Naval Analysis in Arlington, Virginia.
There's a very tight choke point leading from mainland Ukraine into Crimea, makes it easier to defend. And they would have to go by land. The Ukrainians really don't have much of an amphibious capability. They could certainly shell the peninsula if they got close enough, but it would be very hard militarily to take it.
Since the start of Russia's invasion last year, the U.S. has said it supports Ukraine's right to defend its territory. But when it comes to retaking Crimea by military force, things get a little more complicated.
There's the potential for tension if the administration felt that the escalatory risks were too high. The administration has clearly taken steps to feel its way through, the escalation landscape and try not to cause unnecessary escalation. They would continue to assess that. if the Ukrainians were in a position to take Crimea.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Tamila Tasheva is a Ukrainian government official based in Kyiv. But her role is all about Crimea. She's President Zelensky's special representative for the territory.
I am Crimean Tatar. I am Ukrainian citizen. I born in Uzbekistan. When I 5 years old, I returned with my parents, with my grandmother to Crimea, where my parents even now live in Crimea, in temporarily occupied territory.
Thousands of Crimean Tatars have similar stories. In May 1944, as a result of Stalin's orders, tens of thousands of Crimean Tatars were deported from their native homelands. They were forcibly relocated to Soviet republics in Central Asia. In the process, thousands of Crimean Tatars died.
When Crimean Tatars is deported in 1944, all these Crimean Tatar people in countries of Central Asia, we fight to freedom and fight for returning to Crimea.
In the final years of the Soviet Union, many Crimean Tatars, including Tasheva's family, returned. She says that was a joyful time, but it was not without some difficulties.
It's not easy, of course, because they persecuted Crimean Tatars in the ends of 18th and early 90s.
The government made it almost impossible for Crimean Tatars to reclaim lost property. Buying land and building new homes was also difficult. Still, tens of thousands of Crimean Tatars resettled in their homeland as the Soviet Union fell apart and Ukraine gained independence. Life back in Ukraine started feeling normal, but everything changed in 2014. Here's Tamila Tasheva again.
In 2014, it's really military operation of occupation of territory. And Crimean Tatars do not support Russia because of persecution. Crimean Tatars start to flee in Crimea, but most stay and live in Crimea.
Over the last year, Russia has intensified its crackdown on Crimean Tatar institutions and civil society. Tasheva says more than 150 Crimean Tatars are now locked up in Russian prisons.
Ukrainian state don't have access to Crimea, but of course we have a lot of communication and connection with our people. And of course we support our people. For us, very important to maintain some connections between Crimea and mainland of Ukraine.
Tasheva says she and her team are already planning for the eventual liberation of Crimea from Russian occupation.
I totally agree with my president. For Ukraine, victory is mean we liberate all our territories, including with Autonomous Republic of Crimea and city of Sevastopol.
Back at Irfan Kudusov's restaurant, he explains the irony of his life as a Crimean Tatar living in the Ukrainian capital.
У нас люди в оккупации живут, а мы здесь, да, мы как бы на свободе, но не дома. Они дома, но не на свободе. Такой парадокс.
We have our freedom, but not our home, he tells me. While Crimean Tatars still in Crimea have their home, but they don't have freedom. Kudusov brings up the painting with the stork again, the bird trapped in a golden cage.
Это мне говорит опыт не только мой сегодняшний, да, человека, которому 54 года, а и опыт моего отца.
He says his family waited for decades to return to Crimea. And they did, back in the early 90s. And now, once more, he says he has no doubt that Crimean Tatars driven out by the Russian invasion will return as well.
Japan is changing its policy around nuclear power. Last Friday, the cabinet agreed to allow nuclear reactors to be operated beyond their current 60-year limit. The policy also calls for new reactors to replace aging ones. This is all about reducing carbon emissions, but when you mention nuclear power and Japan in the same sentence, what comes to mind, of course, is the 2011 Fukushima nuclear plant disaster. For a reality check on this news, we reached out to Tobias Harris. He's Deputy Director of the Asia Program at the German Marshall Fund and joins us from Washington. Tobias, Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida approved this new policy on Friday. How have Japan's nuclear regulators responded?
Well, this was actually in coordination with Japan's nuclear regulators, and that really is the reality of this nuclear energy policy shift. There's been a change in public opinion, but the public is more open to the idea. But I think there's a sense that if this was done without the cooperation of nuclear regulators, that public opinion would sour very quickly.
Give us a reality check on Japan, Tobias. Who and what does the country depend on for its energy needs?
Well, it's sort of the standard story of Japan. That they're resource poor, that they've been heavily dependent on fossil fuels imported from the Middle East, to some extent also from Russia, natural gas from Southeast Asia as well as the Middle East, and increasingly the United States. And so they import all of their fossil fuels. They are very conscious of this. And nuclear energy certainly gave them an option for at least some energy security, that, this was an indigenous power source, although, of course, their nuclear fuel cycle was not entirely indigenous, but something that they could, have dependable source of power at home. And of course, that is part after the war in Ukraine revealed the risks of overseas energy dependence has, I think, contributed to the push to restart reactors.
And given that energy dependence on other places and sources of fuel, I'm curious, what percentage in Japan is nuclear right now?
That's the thing, though. So there's been a gradual process of restarting nuclear reactors that were taken offline after that 2011 disaster. And there's been at least a written goal of getting to something around 20 or 22% of Japan's electricity generation from nuclear for a number of years now. But because of the regulatory process, they've gotten nowhere near that. The fact is, if they've reached 10%, that would be a lot. It is a small share of their electricity generation right now.
I'm curious, what was the percentage of nuclear power in Japan before the Fukushima disaster in 2011?
So in 2011, Japan was getting approximately 30% of its electricity from nuclear and was really planning on extending that and growing that over the following decade. But obviously, that's not what happened.
That's extraordinary. There was a real drawdown then after that disaster.
Yes, that's correct.
There was a lot of alarm over nuclear right after that 2011 earthquake, tsunami, and that crashed into the Fukushima nuclear plant, setting off several meltdowns. What safeguards were put in place after that disaster?
So you had the creation of an entirely new regulator that was really going to take a close look at every reactor in the country for its safety, its seismic risks, certainly scrutinizing types of reactors in particular that were similar to the ones that melted down at the Fukushima Daiichi plant. Basically, there's been a process where they turned them all off and then having this extensive review process before approving their restart. And that also is not just a regulatory process, it's also a political process, because even if the regulators approve, that you have to get the local governments and the prefectural governments to agree to turning them on. So there's been a lot of deference to public opinion, to local public opinion, sort of acknowledging that this cannot be rushed through, that you have to assure that the public is confident in the review that the regulators have conducted.
So this is about diversifying, really, Japan's energy mix. Is this new plan all about cutting carbon emissions? And isn't that a relatively new argument for nuclear power?
That's absolutely right. In fact, in the past, it was much more about energy security. It was much more, energy independence. Now, I think you've seen in the last 2 years or so, basically ever since the Japanese government adopted a 2050 zero emissions target, that it's become much more common for proponents of nuclear energy to make a decarbonization case for nuclear energy, much, much more than one ever heard in the past.
If that's how the government in Japan is making its pitch, do you think it will work to convince the nuclear antagonists and skeptics?
It's hard to say because, the opposition, justifiably, 2011 was a really frightening event for not just, of course, within Japan, ramifications for nuclear power around the globe. And the opponents of nuclear energy, I think, just, don't entirely trust the process. They don't entirely trust the politicians. I don't think they're convinced entirely by the regulatory process. So that opposition is, I think, resistant to some of the arguments and certainly to the people making the arguments in favor of nuclear power. But that said, it does seem, certainly looking at opinion polls on the whole, that the public in general is starting to shift, that you are seeing people respond, whether it's from an environmental perspective or just bringing energy costs down. The public might be starting to shift, but I think it's still a vulnerable shift, and the government has to be very careful about how it proceeds here.
Tobias Harris with the German Marshall Fund speaking with us about Japan's plan to go big on nuclear again, one small step at a time. Tobias, thank you very much.